The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly under a crimson sunset, where silence was a man's only companion and survival meant trusting no one. Jake Morrison had been living this truth for 7 years on his isolated ranch, 30 miles from the nearest settlement. The howling of coyotes had become his nightly lullaby, their distant calls echoing across the barren landscape like ghosts from another world. He'd grown accustomed to the solitude, finding comfort in the predictable routine of tending cattle, mending fences, and watching the seasons change from his wooden porch. But on this particular October evening in 1882, something was different. The coyotes weren't howling from the distant hills as usual. Instead, their calls seemed closer, more urgent, almost as if they were trying to warn him about something approaching through the darkness. Jake set down his coffee mug and reached for the Winchester rifle that never left his side. At 43, he'd survived Indian raids, cattle rustlers, and the harsh winters that claimed weaker men. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked the rifle's chamber, muscle memory from countless nights when danger lurked beyond the firelight. The wind carried an unfamiliar scent, something that didn't belong in his carefully ordered world. It wasn't the musty smell of approaching rain or the sharp tang of sagebrush. This was different, foreign, carrying hints of wood smoke and something else he couldn't quite identify. As he stepped off the porch, his boots crunched against the frost-covered ground. The temperature had dropped dramatically since sunset, and his breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. The ranch house stood like a lonely sentinel against the vast emptiness, its windows glowing warmly in the encroaching darkness. Jake had built this place with his own hands after the war, choosing isolation over the complications that came with neighbors and townsfolk. He'd learned that people brought trouble, and trouble had a way of following a man no matter how far he ran. The coyotes suddenly fell silent, their abrupt quiet more unsettling than their howling had been. Jake's grip tightened on his rifle as he scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of movement in the pale moonlight. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the dry grass. Then, emerging from the shadows like a specter, he saw a figure on horseback approaching slowly along the dirt trail that led to his ranch. The rider sat hunched forward in the saddle, clearly exhausted and struggling to stay upright. Even from a distance, Jake could tell this wasn't a threat, at least not the kind he was used to facing. The horse moved with the plodding gait of an animal pushed beyond its limits, and the rider swayed dangerously with each step. As they drew closer, moonlight revealed what Jake hadn't expected to see in this godforsaken corner of the territory. The rider was a woman, her long black hair flowing loose around her shoulders, her face marked by exhaustion and something deeper, something that looked like desperation. She wore the traditional dress of the Cherokee, its intricate beadwork catching the moonlight despite being travel-stained and torn. Her horse, a paint mare with distinctive markings, stumbled slightly as it approached the ranch house. The woman raised her head, and Jake could see her dark eyes searching his face, looking for some sign of the kind of man he might be. There was intelligence in those eyes, and caution, but also a bone-deep weariness that spoke of hardships he could only imagine. Jake lowered his rifle but kept it ready, his mind racing through the implications of this unexpected arrival. Cherokee weren't common in this part of Wyoming, and a woman traveling alone was rarer still. The Indian Wars had left scars on both sides, creating a complex web of mistrust and violence that made such encounters dangerous for everyone involved. But something about this woman's bearing, the quiet dignity in her posture despite her obvious exhaustion, gave him pause. The woman brought her horse to a stop about 20 feet from where Jake stood, close enough to speak but far enough to run if necessary. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong despite her fatigue, carrying the slight accent of someone who had learned English as a second language but mastered it completely. She asked for shelter, not as a beggar might, but with the quiet confidence of someone who understood their own worth. Her name was Ayana, she said, which meant eternal blossom in her people's language. She had been traveling for 5 days, fleeing from something she didn't immediately specify. Jake found himself studying her face in the moonlight, noting the high cheekbones and strong jaw that spoke of noble lineage among her people. There were lines around her eyes that suggested she'd seen more than her share of sorrow, but also a steel in her gaze that told him she was no victim. This was a woman who had survived whatever had driven her to his doorstep, and survival in this territory required both strength and cunning. The question that plagued Jake was what exactly she was running from, and whether helping her would bring that danger to his own door. The smart thing would be to refuse, to send her on her way with perhaps some food and water but no further involvement. Jake had learned the hard way that getting involved in other people's troubles rarely ended well. But as he looked at this woman, sitting straight in her saddle despite obvious exhaustion, something in his chest tightened. Perhaps it was the memory of his own desperate nights, the times when he'd needed help and found none. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition of another wounded soul trying to find peace in an unforgiving world. Against his better judgment, Jake found himself nodding toward the barn. She could shelter there for the night, he told her, and her horse could rest in one of the stalls. It wasn't much, but it would keep her warm and dry until morning. As she dismounted, moving with the fluid grace of someone raised in harmony with nature, Jake caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. There, barely visible in the folds of her dress, was the unmistakable stain of dried blood. Ayanna noticed his stare and followed his gaze to the bloodstain. For a moment, her composure faltered, and Jake saw a flash of something that might have been fear or guilt or both. She pulled her shawl tighter around herself, but not before Jake noticed other details that painted a disturbing picture. Her hands, though graceful, bore cuts and scrapes that suggested recent violence. Her dress, beneath the travel dust, showed signs of having been torn and hastily mended. As Jake led her toward the barn, his mind raced with possibilities. The blood could be hers, evidence of an injury she'd sustained during her flight, but it could just as easily belong to someone else, someone who might have tried to stop her from leaving wherever she'd come from. The thought that he might be harboring someone who had committed violence sat uneasily with Jake. But he'd committed himself to offering shelter, and a man's word meant everything in this territory. The barn was warm and filled with the comfortable smells of hay and horses. Jake lit a lantern and showed Ayanna to an empty stall that he'd lined with fresh straw. She moved through the routine of caring for her horse with practiced efficiency, her hands gentle as she removed the saddle and rubbed down the tired animal. Watching her work, Jake found himself impressed by her obvious skill and the bond she shared with the paint mare. This wasn't someone who'd stolen a horse and fled in panic. This was a horsewoman born and bred, someone who understood these animals as partners rather than mere transportation. When the horse was settled with feed and water, Ayanna turned to Jake with an expression that mixed gratitude with wariness. She thanked him for his kindness but made it clear she expected nothing more than what he'd already offered. There was dignity in her refusal to ask for additional help, but also a sadness that suggested she'd learned not to expect kindness from the world. Jake found himself curious about her story, but experience had taught him that pushing for answers usually drove people away. Instead, he simply told her that there was a water pump behind the barn if she needed to wash, and that he'd bring her some food before he turned in for the night. As he walked back to the house, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this woman's arrival was going to change everything about his carefully ordered life. The coyotes had resumed their howling, but now their calls seemed different, more urgent, as if they too sensed that something significant had shifted in the balance of things. Back in the kitchen, Jake prepared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried meat, adding a jar of peaches he'd been saving for a special occasion. As he worked, he found himself thinking about the last time a woman had been in his home. That had been almost 8 years ago, before Sarah's death had driven him to seek solitude in this remote corner of the territory. The memory of his wife still had the power to stop him in his tracks, filling him with a mixture of love and regret that time had done little to diminish. Sarah would have welcomed Ayanna without question, Jake knew. His wife had possessed a generous heart that saw the best in everyone, even when that optimism had sometimes put them in danger. She would have insisted on bringing the Cherokee woman into the house, on providing her with proper shelter and medical attention if she was injured. But Sarah was gone, taken by a fever that no amount of love or prayer could cure, and Jake had learned to be more cautious with his trust. When he returned to the barn with the food, Jake found Ayanna sitting cross-legged on the straw, her long hair now braided and her face cleaned of travel dust. She looked younger than he'd initially thought, probably in her early 30s, though her eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from enduring hardship. She accepted the food with quiet thanks and ate with the deliberate pace of someone who had known hunger and didn't take meals for granted. As she ate, Ayanna began to tell Jake fragments of her story, carefully choosing which details to share and which to keep hidden. She was indeed Cherokee, from a small community in the Oklahoma Territory that had been trying to maintain their traditional ways despite government pressure to assimilate. She'd been married, she said, but her husband had died the previous winter, leaving her alone and vulnerable in a world that had little place for Cherokee widows. The bloodstain, she explained, had come from a wound she'd received while defending herself from men who thought a lone Indian woman was easy prey. Jake listened without comment, recognizing the careful way she constructed her narrative. He'd done the same thing himself when pressed for details about his past, sharing enough truth to satisfy curiosity while keeping the painful parts safely buried. There was clearly more to her story, darker chapters that she wasn't ready to reveal to a stranger. But what she'd told him rang true, and Jake found himself believing that she was indeed a victim rather than a perpetrator of whatever violence had marked her journey. The next morning brought an unseasonably warm day, with clear skies that stretched endlessly over the prairie. Jake had expected to find Ayanna gone when he checked the barn, but she was still there, grooming her horse with methodical care. She greeted him politely and asked if there was work she could do to repay his hospitality. The offer surprised Jake, who had grown accustomed to people taking what they needed and moving on without looking back. Despite his initial intention to send her on her way, Jake found himself agreeing to let her stay for a few days. The ranch could certainly use an extra pair of hands, he rationalized, and her horse needed more time to recover from the hard journey. But truthfully, Jake was beginning to enjoy having another person around, someone to break the monotonous routine of his solitary existence. Ayanna worked with quiet efficiency, tackling chores that Jake had been putting off for months. She repaired tears in the barn roof, organized his chaotic storage areas, and even began preparing meals that were far more elaborate than the simple fare Jake usually managed for himself. Her presence brought a sense of life to the ranch that had been missing since Sarah's death, and Jake found himself looking forward to their conversations in the evening after the day's work was done. Ayanna possessed a sharp intelligence and a dry sense of humor that made even mundane topics engaging. But even as Jake grew comfortable with her presence, he couldn't shake the feeling that danger was following in her wake. The coyotes continued their strange behavior, howling at odd hours and in patterns that seemed almost like warnings. His cattle grew skittish, gathering in tight groups and startling at shadows. Most troubling of all, Jake began noticing signs that someone had been watching the ranch from a distance. Horse tracks appeared and disappeared along the ridge line, and he occasionally caught glimpses of reflected sunlight that might have been someone using field glasses to observe them. When Jake mentioned his concerns to Ayanna, her reaction confirmed his suspicions that she hadn't told him the complete truth about her situation. The color drained from her face, and her hands trembled slightly as she set down the cup of coffee she'd been drinking. She admitted that there might be men following her, but insisted they would move on once they realized she wasn't worth the trouble of pursuing across such difficult terrain. Jake pressed for more details, his concern growing as he realized the potential danger they both faced. Ayanna's story began to unravel as she reluctantly revealed additional information. Her husband hadn't simply died of natural causes, she admitted. He'd been murdered by white men who wanted the small piece of land their family had managed to hold onto despite government pressure to relocate. When Ayanna had tried to seek justice through official channels, she'd been told that Indian testimony wasn't worth much against white witnesses. Frustrated and grieving, Ayanna had taken matters into her own hands. She discovered evidence that the men who killed her husband were part of a larger conspiracy involving corrupt government officials and land speculators. The documents she'd found outlined a systematic plan to drive Cherokee families from their property through intimidation and violence, clearing the way for white settlement and development. When she'd confronted one of the conspirators with this evidence, the encounter had turned violent. The bloodstain on her dress, Ayanna finally admitted, belonged to Thomas Whitmore, a government agent who'd been part of the conspiracy. He tried to force himself on her when she'd refused his demand to hand over the documents. And in the struggle that followed, she'd managed to grab a letter opener from his desk. She hadn't intended to kill him, but the wound had been deeper than she'd realized. And by the time help arrived, Whitmore was dead. Jake listened to this revelation with growing unease, understanding now why Ayanna had been so reluctant to share her full story. Killing a white government official, even in self-defense, was the kind of crime that could bring down the full weight of federal justice on an Indian woman. The men following her weren't just seeking revenge for a personal slight. They were likely federal marshals or hired guns working for the conspiracy, determined to silence her before she could expose their crimes. The implications of harboring a fugitive weighed heavily on Jake's mind as he considered his options. The smart choice would be to send Ayanna away immediately, before her pursuers could connect him to her flight. But looking at this woman who had shown such courage in fighting injustice, Jake found himself thinking about his own past and the choices that had driven him to this isolated ranch. He too had blood on his hands, though his violence had been sanctioned by war rather than condemned by law. During the Civil War, Jake had served with a unit that had committed atrocities in the name of victory, acts that haunted his dreams even now. He'd come to Wyoming partly to escape those memories, but also to escape the men who might someday hold him accountable for what he'd done in uniform. In Ayanna, he recognized a kindred spirit, someone who had been forced by circumstances to make an impossible choice and was now paying the price for that decision. As the days passed, Jake found himself growing more protective of Ayanna, though he was careful not to express his feelings too openly. She'd been hurt enough by men who claimed to care about her, and Jake understood that trust would have to be earned slowly and carefully. Instead, he focused on practical preparations, cleaning his weapons and checking the ranch's defenses while trying to appear casual about these activities. The evidence that they were being watched continued to accumulate. Jake found cigarette butts at observation points that offered clear views of the ranch house and barn. His horses grew increasingly nervous, picking up scents and sounds that human senses couldn't detect. Most ominously, Jake discovered that someone had been examining the hoofprints around his property, clearly trying to determine how many people and animals were present at the ranch. When Jake shared these observations with Ayanna, she made a decision that both impressed and terrified him. Rather than flee again and bring danger to another innocent person, she would make a stand here and face whatever was coming. She'd spent too much of her life running from injustice, she said, and she was tired of letting evil men control her fate through fear and intimidation. Together, they began preparing the ranch for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation. Jake showed Ayanna how to use his spare rifle, discovering that she was already an accomplished markswoman who had learned to hunt and fight alongside the men of her tribe. They identified defensive positions around the ranch buildings and established signals they could use to communicate if they were separated during a fight. As they worked side by side, preparing for battle, Jake found himself admiring Ayanna's calm courage in the face of overwhelming odds. She didn't complain about the danger she'd brought to his doorstep or try to minimize the risks they both faced. Instead, she applied herself to the task of survival with the same methodical dedication she brought to every other aspect of life. On the fifth night after Ayanna's arrival, the waiting ended. Jake woke to the sound of his horses whinnying in alarm, their distress calls cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like warnings of approaching doom. Through his bedroom window, he could see dark shapes moving between the outbuildings, and the red glow of cigarettes betrayed the positions of men who thought they held every advantage. Moving quietly, Jake gathered his weapons and crept toward the barn where Ayanna was sleeping. He found her already awake and armed, having been alerted by the same sounds that had roused him. Together, they counted at least 6 men surrounding the ranch, moving with the coordinated precision of experienced manhunters. These weren't opportunistic criminals or local troublemakers. They were professionals, probably federal marshals or Pinkerton agents, men who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who stood between them and their quarry. The attack began at dawn, with the methodical efficiency that Jake had witnessed during the war. The hunters had positioned themselves to cover all escape routes, then began tightening their circle around the ranch buildings. Their leader, a tall man with a distinctive scar across his left cheek, called out for Ayanna to surrender herself and avoid bloodshed. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having his commands obeyed, but also an undertone of menace that suggested he preferred violence to negotiation. Ayana's response was a rifle shot that sent the scarred man diving for cover behind a water trough. The message was clear. She would not go quietly, and anyone who wanted her would have to fight for the privilege. The battle that followed tested every skill Jake had learned as a soldier and everything Ayana had absorbed from her warrior heritage. The fight raged for hours, with both sides using the ranch buildings and natural terrain to gain tactical advantages. Jake and Ayana worked together with surprising synchronization, covering each other's movements and coordinating their fire to maximum effect. But despite their skill and determination, they were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Jake began to wonder if their brave stand would end in capture or death, with Ayana's evidence dying with her. Then, just as their situation seemed most desperate, an unexpected sound echoed across the prairie. It was the war cry of Cherokee warriors, rising like thunder from the hills surrounding the ranch. Ayana's eyes widened in amazement as mounted figures appeared on the ridgelines, their faces painted for battle and their weapons glinting in the morning sun. Her cousin Running Bear had followed her trail, bringing a war party to ensure her safe passage to sanctuary among their people. The arrival of Cherokee reinforcements changed the entire dynamic of the battle. The federal agents found themselves caught between two forces, their carefully planned operation dissolving into chaos as arrows and rifle fire poured down from the surrounding hills. The scarred leader tried to rally his men for a final assault on the ranch house, but his authority crumbled as his hunters realized they were facing skilled warriors fighting on terrain they knew intimately. In the end, only 3 of the federal agents survived to flee back toward civilization, their mission a complete failure. The scarred leader lay dead beside the water trough where he'd taken cover, his dreams of promotion and reward buried with him in the Wyoming soil. Jake surveyed the aftermath of the battle with mixed emotions, grateful to be alive but sobered by the violence that had shattered his peaceful refuge. Running Bear approached the ranch house with the cautious respect due to a man who had proven himself in battle. He thanked Jake for protecting Ayana and offered him a place among their people if he ever tired of the solitary life. The offer was sincere, Jake realized, a genuine invitation to join a community that valued courage and honor above the color of a man's skin. But perhaps the most significant change came in Ayana herself. The successful defense of the ranch had given her something she'd lost when her husband was murdered: the confidence that justice was possible, even in a world dominated by corrupt officials and violent men. The evidence she carried would find its way to honest authorities. She promised Jake, and the conspiracy that had destroyed her family would finally be exposed. As the Cherokee war party prepared to escort Ayana to safety, Jake found himself facing a choice he hadn't expected. She asked him to come with her, to start a new life where his past wouldn't matter and his skills would be valued. The offer was tempting, especially as Jake contemplated returning to his empty ranch house and resuming the solitary existence that had suddenly lost much of its appeal. In the end, Jake chose to remain at his ranch, but with a new understanding of what his life could become. Ayana promised to return when her legal battles were resolved, and Jake promised to be waiting when she did. Their parting was bittersweet, marked by the knowledge that they had found something precious in each other, but would have to wait for the right time to explore what that connection might become. The ranch felt different after Ayana's departure, not empty but full of potential. Jake resumed his daily routine, but now he found himself making improvements with an eye toward someday sharing the space with another person. The Coyotes returned to their normal patterns, their urgent warnings no longer needed now that the immediate danger had passed. And sometimes, when the wind was right, Jake could swear he heard the distant sound of Cherokee drums, promising that he was no longer truly alone in the vast Wyoming territory.